Welcome to On the Right Side of History with Kansans for Life. Come with us as we connect the pro-life movement's past to present, uncover hidden or forgotten history, and its connections to the battle still raging today. Now, here's our host, Danielle Underwood.
I am really excited to be back with you and to welcome you and to welcome an amazing ally to the fight to protect vulnerable lives. Our guest story has taken twists and turns that led her to work in an issue many people don't even realize relates to abortion, the dark world of human trafficking. So hopefully you saw from the show notes that we'd be diving into this today, but just in case, I wanted to give a word of warning to those who might have little ones nearby who could be listening in. This is a topic that mature people can and must talk about and begin to understand, but younger children will probably not be ready for this conversation. So with that, I just wanted to say Tatiana Burgum is with us today. Tatiana Burgum joins the podcast today from Minnesota, where she lives with her 2 children and her husband. So welcome, Tatiana.
Hello. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
We're so grateful to you for being here. This is a really important conversation.
Yes.
And I was so thrilled to be connected with you and to find out what you're doing. There's just this interesting cross-section between the world that I'm working in and the world you're working in.
Yes,
and
there sure is.
We need to shine a light on it. So this is a great opportunity for us to, bring our experiences together, our topics together, and help to do that, help to have this conversation. So, Tatiana, you began your career working in communications at the National Right to Life Committee. Yes? So you were in Washington, D.C.
I was, for 5 years doing communications, and then also just the world of nonprofit work, as you know, is like you're also doing everything else that's needed
Yes.
like at any given week. So I also got to do policy specific work, legislation, and then also just dabbled in fundraising, attempted to, and just a lot of different areas. But NRLC is it feels like home to me still. So it was such an amazing experience.
Wonderful. You were deputy press secretary there.
I was, Yep. So I did, communications and press releases. And that was really my first big girl job, I will say. And that experience is something that just set me up in my trajectory to where I am now in such a unique way. So I'm forever grateful.
Wonderful. So you still are an at-large board member there too.
I am,
right?
yeah. I can't even believe I actually started at NRLC as a teenager. I was doing youth. They have the National Teens for Life conference each year alongside their regular National Right to Life conference. And so my parents started going to the conference, and I would go to the teen conference. And then from there, I just stayed connected, and I was an intern as well through college. And so, just a really cool opportunity that came up, and I loved it.
What a great way to start. Yeah. So in 2018, it sounds like your life took a really different turn, and that maybe it was even an unexpected turn from what I've heard and what I've heard you talk about on other podcasts and other places. So you took this, you became your professional capacity. You ended up directing your energy into directly assisting victims of sex trafficking. Can you, tell us just briefly what attracted you to working with victims of sex trafficking, going from the pro-life world into that? Tell us about that bridge.
It was a bridge that I never knew was even going to be a bridge in my life. I honestly, my career goal was to be in the pro-life space forever, to be working in NRLC, policy, legislation, that type of thing. When I left NRLC, I was burnt out. I'm sure many can relate to just if you're in policy, if you're in communications, you're on 24/7, no matter what, it's a lot. So we moved to Minnesota to be close to our family. And I took this job at like a really small, rural, middle of nowhere school. And I was like, this will be perfect. It's like, school hours, it's great. And I started to work with a lot of young people, and I noticed that they were experiencing what I didn't realize at the time was trafficking and exploitation. And they were getting picked up by people. They were trading sex for things of value. And I just was like, but no one was really saying anything about it or doing anything about it. And I just was like, what is happening? How is this going under the radar? We're working on mental health. That was the reason I was working in the school, but no one was addressing the sexual piece of it, this like exchange for sex acts, all that stuff. And so I went to my director. Our organization was huge, and he said, like, oh, we have an anti-trafficking program. And I was like, what? I need to get in touch with this person. We connected. It was never on my radar. Just never thought I would ever work in this space. I didn't know anything about it. Months went by. By the time her and I sat down, she was like, listen, I'm out of here. I'm going to start my own business. I think you would be great to step into my position. And I was like, what? No, I don't know anything about trafficking. And she was like, I'll teach you. Let's do it. And so that was the start. And I always say that because I think people think that like in order to go into these spaces of like the pro-life space or the anti-trafficking space, you have to have some type of resume or experience. And that's not the case. I had nothing. I was like not understanding, like I didn't know the policy around it. There was no understanding. So so I started in the work, and very, very quickly I realized that the youth that I started working with were going to Planned Parenthood, were being taken to get abortions, were being, or vice versa. The thing that also we don't talk about a lot is that they were being forced to keep their children because those children were going to then be used to be trafficked. And so there was just a huge realization, this is an issue of life.
Wow, so much packed into that.
Yeah.
So we know that, probably a lot of our audience may have some familiarity with the topic of sex trafficking, human trafficking. Maybe some of them have seen Sound of Freedom. It was such an amazing movie that had a lot of success earlier this year and opened so many people's eyes to the world that is truly there and present in our world, in our larger world. But I wonder if, for those who are a little less familiar, I wonder if we should just define human trafficking and kind of what that looks like.
Yeah, exactly. So I had thrown out a few terms, exploitation and human trafficking. And really, human trafficking is like an umbrella term, and it covers things like exploitation. So exploitation is when there are typically like two people involved, someone who's being exploited. They might be exchanging something for a need they have to get something like housing or some type of stability or basic need met. And they might be trading a sexual favors or a sex act, but there is two people involved. That's the exploitation piece. When trafficking happens, there is a third party or more. So that's the difference. When we're talking about trafficking, there's a buyer, there's the trafficker, and then there's the survivor, the person who is essentially being sold to someone else. And there is like a financial gain there. So that is the definition legally, and like how the states define it as well. The difference in all of this is that just like every other type of policy that we have, the federal government has a different definition. So for a case to go to the federal level, a survivor has to have proof that there was like force, fraud, or coercion that was part to essentially have it be called trafficking.
Okay.
Many states take that out. And so I'm not sure what Kansas does, but in Minnesota, you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion for it to be consider a trafficking situation. But that's the difference as well.
Interesting. So I know that just in preparing for this conversation, I found that there has been, and I already knew this, but finding the actual numbers, that there's been a dramatic rise in trafficking in our country. And I was looking at the most recent statistics from the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics, and they were saying that there's in a 10-year period, so from 2011 to 2021, there was a 49% increase in the number of persons who were referred for trafficking offenses. And, I was breaking that down and I was thinking a total of over 2,000 people who were charged with this. And that would, just a simple average at least would tell us that would mean that there were at least 40 traffickers, or around 40 traffickers per state. And then realizing that a lot of those traffickers are probably operating a ring of people that they are trafficking. So you start to kind of build those numbers in your mind and you think, oh my goodness, this is a big problem. And you may have even more recent numbers than that. But I just was very surprised. And the other thing that shocked me was just how lucrative this is, because I saw that, this research that says that it's a highly profitable crime, that traffickers were making between $5,000 and $32,000 per week running these trafficking rings. And that was a few years back. That's not a terribly recent number. That was from, I think, about 5 or 6 years ago. So we know that is, it's extremely profitable for these people, for this crime. And also the other part that really surprised me is that these traffickers self-reported that they frequently use psychological coercion to maintain control over their victims, which I know doesn't surprise you at all because you've heard the stories from these people directly, and also the use of physical violence. And I don't know if there's anything you can share that you know from.
So I guess even to back up to the Department of Justice numbers. So, and I'm going to even back up a little bit further. So when we're looking at the approach to trafficking, there's typically two ways that a state will go about the issue of trafficking. One of those is the criminal justice route, where you have numbers that come from cases and, things that have been prosecuted, things like that. And then we also have what's called a public health route, public health approach. And so that really is where you're in a state that doesn't put any charges against anyone that might be picked up who is a survivor. They're not charging youth. Instead, they're connecting them to services, and there is not a criminal justice approach to it. And so when you look at those numbers, you almost want to double or triple them, because there's also those states that have a public health approach where they might get pulled over by law enforcement, but there's nothing past that because they're then referred to services and supports. And that's kind of where the law enforcement piece ends. So those numbers.
Surely they're charging the traffickers themselves, though, right? Even those ones that have more of a public health.
Yeah, typically, yep.
Okay.
Minnesota. So I work in Minnesota. This is what I'm more familiar with, but I have done national work as well. And so every state has a different approach to it and what they feel is best. In Minnesota, we do feel like the public health approach, instead of because a lot of young people, especially young people, their trafficker might be their boyfriend. It might be a family member. That's very common. Interfamilial trafficking, which is when you have a family member who is like a trafficker, or sometimes it can be like a family business where you have the father who has generationally, the men have been like the traffickers, and the females have generationally kind of been the ones who are being sold to buyers. And those cases, when there's a relationship that is that deep, you aren't going to have survivors who want to take legal action. It's just not going to necessarily happen.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that go into play. And so those numbers, I would say, are double or triple, which is heartbreaking. The other piece of it that I just think we need to talk more about is about the buyers, because without people who are buying sex, we don't have a market. There's just I
Exactly.
think there's a lot of focus on the trafficker, but the trafficker is selling because there's people buying. And so that's the bigger piece of it that we're really trying to turn towards in the issue of the anti-trafficking movement.
Sure. We've got to remove the demand.
Exactly.
Right. Not
Yeah.
just work on the supply side. So, very interesting. So, you're already starting to help me rethink some of these things that assumptions that I'd made, and I had never considered that there might be entire families that this was a generational problem within that family. But I'm wondering,
Yeah.
so what else do we know about trafficking? So one thing I have as a question, I think I myself and maybe a lot of other people would assume that this is really an urban problem. But I'm wondering, I've heard you speak about this, and I'm hoping
Yeah.
you'll fill in our listeners here, because that really applies to Kansans specifically
Yes.
and
Yes.
Midwesterners
Yes.
in general, but yeah, speak to that. Is this an urban problem?
Yeah, so I think that's the number, and that is the assumption I had when I came into this work. But like I said, my work started in rural Minnesota, and then I just saw that it was happening much more in rural areas than it was. Then I would like my referrals. By the time I left the program, I was at 200, a caseload of 200. Out of those 200 young people that were on my caseload, 150 of them were rural Minnesotans. Um,
Wow.
and then
Yes.
the rest of them were like Twin Cities or like our bigger metro areas, Rochester, Minnesota, like those areas that are larger. But yeah, the piece about it is more rural, specifically because traffickers know that if they can isolate young people in these rural communities where they already might feel isolated because there's not access to like, even just fun things to do,
Mm-hmm.
or like they're
Mm-hmm.
living like miles apart between their friends, so they're already feeling isolated. Traffickers, predators hone in on those areas.
And that's
Um,
exactly the opposite of what I would have
yeah,
assumed.
I know. It
That's
is kind of mind-blowing. I would encourage anyone. So in Minnesota, we have what's called the Minnesota Student Survey, and I don't know if it's called that for every state, but it's essentially all the public schools take the survey. In 2019, for the first time, we had a question on our state survey that asked young people, have you ever traded sex for anything of value? And those that took out of those students who took the survey, 2,000 said yes. The highest number of those students were in rural communities, and that number has gone up actually. In 2021 is now the newest survey numbers that we have in Minnesota. Asked the same question. It was our rural communities. It had gone up, I think, about 10%, which is quite a lot. Like, so again, that shows us that predators, traffickers are really honing in on these areas because of the isolation piece. And also because of the socioeconomic status of many of our rural communities as well.
Yeah. So if we're looking at the population of Minnesota, that's 5.72 million is the most
Yeah.
recent number I could find. And I know
Yeah.
Kansas, we're at 3 million, so we're a little more than half of your size. So I'm
Yeah.
just thinking in my mind, how do we if we applied that same thinking, I mean, we'd have at least 1,000 high school students in our state
Yeah.
who are potentially being trafficked right now.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
not a
Or at
small,
least
it's not a
that
small problem.
exploitation. No, it's not small. And I will say, so I've actually had the opportunity to work a lot with Kansas on this issue of trafficking of youth, and there's amazing work happening in Kansas,
That's great to hear.
specifically coming from like the child protection spaces. There's also like a really specific focus on youth who go missing or youth who go on run. And so there's some really, really amazing things happening. And so if anyone is listening from the state of Kansas and you want to get involved, you're in the right place because there's really amazing things happening.
Awesome. We're going to talk more about that at the end of
Yes,
our conversation, what people can do to help.
exactly.
If this is something that touches your heart, there are things you can do, little or big, and we'll get to that for sure. to get back to our conversation, just about to wrap our minds around what trafficking looks like. I know that I've heard you speak about those who are kind of what are the characteristics of the person who is most vulnerable to these traffickers who approach them. And I think I read that the typical young person who gets involved is between the ages of 12 to 16 when they get either lured into this life, coerced.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Numbers, I would say it varies. Those of us who really are doing like nationwide work, stay away from those statistics just because we have noticed that isn't necessarily the case for the youth that we are working with.
Okay.
And also, you factor in many youth in the foster care system are very vulnerable. And so that's where the numbers typically come from. That age range is typically for those who are within the foster care system. Because there really sometimes isn't like oversight as they're going from house to house. We also find a lot of abuse that's happening within the foster care homes that these youth are placed in. And so they might run from the home and meet someone who's dangerous, but also that dangerous person we're seeing can be someone that they were placed with. So there's a lot of factors that aren't necessarily put into those numbers. But yes, that I think is the typical statistic.
So quick side note, I think that's an important time for us to plug and say, we need more amazing families to step in and say, I want to be part of the foster care system because I know I can provide a safe, loving home for these kids who so need it. And I know amazing families who do foster. Yeah.
Amazing. And I think the families who are willing to be willing to get yourself trained on this issue, to be willing to understand trauma and how trauma plays into sexual violence. Like there's so many things, I think, even before someone says, I want to bring in youth into my home, there's so many things to understand around trauma and sexual violence that these young people are experiencing that can play a role in if they're actually going to be able to stabilize in your house. Even though you're a wonderful, safe person, there's so much that goes into understanding the dynamics of a youth who's experienced trafficking.
The good news is that sounds like there are resources to help get you ready. There's so
many resources.
Yeah. So if you have a heart and a love for these young people who may have experienced, had a rough start to their lives, you might make the difference in their life.
Absolutely.
So where do these predators typically find their victims? I mean, beyond the familial ties, but if we're talking about, strangers approaching young people to try to attract them into this, where are they going to look for these victims?
Yeah, well, I will say that the majority of the work I've done, it has not been strangers. It has been people that young people have known and trusted, built relationships with. Not people that they're just randomly meeting. And so that's another huge myth that we really dispel when I go out and do trainings nationally and in my own community. It's oftentimes we have the idea of the white van, or we're thinking of like the Taken movie. Those situations do happen, but predators are smart. Traffickers are smart. They're gonna do two things, and these are the two things that I commonly see, is they are building a relationship with that young person. So it might happen over a number of years where that person becomes a trusted person in their life, or they're going to do it through what's called a peer recruiter, who is someone who's the same age as whoever they're trying to recruit. And that person is sent in to build relationships with young people and then recruit them based on the trust that was built. So we're not finding that it does happen, like I said, but we're not finding that the majority of situations are just strangers coming in to take children. They're building relationships with them.
Okay, so this is a longer term process.
Yeah.
And they're courting these kids.
Yeah. Yep. Or online too. So like another piece of what I have done a lot of is like the online safety piece of it. And so I do see that online it is quicker to build relationships. If you have a young person who is just already feeling isolated, there's already depression happening, they're really vulnerable to someone coming in and just saying, "Hey, I can help you with all of this." But yeah, there is that trust building first, but it's not real trust building. Of course, it's that manipulation and that grooming tactics that happen.
Yeah, that makes a
Yeah.
lot of sense. Just another quick side note about Kansas in particular, since that's, where we're coming from in Kansans
Yeah.
for Life, is that, I know from the previous Attorney General's office here put out a report a few years ago, and they talked about how Kansas really is a trafficking hub for the Midwest mostly because we're on this I-70 and I-35 corridors. So we've got these two major interstates and they're intersecting here in one of our major metropolitan areas, and we're the center of the country, and there's lots of commerce and shipping going on here, constantly movement of people and products through our highways. So I'm sure that that's not uncommon, but at least according to them, that made us particularly vulnerable to being that kind of hub.
Absolutely.
Sad thing. But so let's pivot now. This was so helpful to kind of get our minds around what that's looking like. It sounds like typically, I mean, we know that there are adults who are trapped in sex trafficking.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But a lot of times it is starting at a very young age, and they're maybe trafficked up through their later years as well.
Yes.
But we want to make this connection now between trafficking and abortion, because that's at Kansans for Life. We're the pro-life organization, the lead pro-life organization in our state, and that's our main focus. But only a fool, I think, would deny that there's a connection here between trafficking and abortion. It just makes sense.
Yeah.
And we know that abortion is a tool for traffickers to be able to control their victims and to keep exploiting them. And so I wonder, what can you help inform us with about that in particular?
My opinion on this may not be the most popular opinion, but what I learned fairly quickly is that if I was going to help young people on both sides of this, I needed to build relationships where I didn't necessarily want to build relationships. And so I actually went into Planned Parenthood, asked them if I could train them on dynamics of trafficking, what it looked like. And then I worked on building relationships so that if they suspected, they could reach out to me. And what was interesting was that over time and over building relationships, they would actually reach out to me before a young woman would have an abortion, because they were so concerned about the trafficking piece of it that they would then reach out to me to say, "Hey, I think this person needs help." So that was one of the most interesting things. I also just want to caveat by saying, of course, Planned Parenthood is the largest abortion provider in the nation. We all know this. There has to be a bridge, though. We have to be able to build a bridge to stop both issues. And without building that bridge, we are not going to be able to push forward the way we really want to, which is helping women become mothers, helping them heal from abortions as well. So I would, of course, get referrals from women who had already had abortions, but once they would have training on trafficking, they could then say, like, okay, I'm realizing that this trafficker has brought in 5 women this week to get abortions. And so we have to be able to have some of those conversations with those on the other side in order to be able to connect the dots. And that's not a super common ideal point of view within the pro-life space. But I think it's becoming, we're shifting because we're seeing that need for a wider understanding of life issues.
Well, we are fully in favor of. We believe in compassion for women.
Yes,
compassion
exactly.
for women who have suffered the horrors of abortion, who have healing that they need to find, and we believe that it's essential to support women, especially victims of trafficking.
Yes.
So unfortunately, we also know from exposés, I'm glad to hear that you've had that experience, but we know that may not be
Yeah.
the standard. We know that
Yeah.
certain abortion providers have enabled
Yeah.
traffickers, and that there have been undercover investigations that happened that showed that definitively.
Yes.
So I think it is
Yes.
important for us to realize that, they, unfortunately, both the abortion industry and the human trafficking, sex trafficking industries, they profit off of.
They profit off of each other.
They do,
They do.
and they profit off of human suffering, and
Yes.
that's the really sad sad thing here, that we have to realize that, I pulled this very there was this groundbreaking study that Loyola University of Chicago did, where they looked at the stories of 66 survivors, and of those 66, there were a total of these women reported 114 abortions, and of the 66 women. So we know that they're having repeated abortions, and we knew that the majority of those they reported were coerced abortions. And I was really just so saddened by one particular story that this report highlighted, where the survivor said that she had endured 6 abortions, and that she had said, quote, "I was under serious pressure from my pimps to abort the babies." And that, really sadly, that survivor of 6 abortions ended up getting severe infections from that scar tissue, and ended up having to have a hysterectomy. And then she could no longer bear the children that she ultimately wanted to have. So there's just these sad stories where women are not protected. And this pure drive for profit at the expense of other people is the sickening thing that we have to realize it's happening. And somehow we've got to provide more support for these women who are experiencing this, so that they do not have to live these horror stories. It's not fair. It's not fair that any child should have to be put through this. It's not fair for any woman to have to deal with that kind of coercion, abuse, physical violence. And, there were other stories too that I won't get into here, but it was a really powerful testimony to, first of all, these amazing survivors who were so resilient that they could come back and still rebuild their lives. But also just the extreme nature of that trafficking system, and how it put they were nothing more than chattel in that system. And unfortunately, the abortion providers exacerbated that situation by performing these repeated abortions, even in the situation.
Yes. I think, that's so heartbreaking to hear. And I think too, the other piece I had mentioned earlier is that I've had mothers, and it's interesting to me, the majority of the young people I've worked with were predominantly pro-life. Now, they wouldn't have terminology for that, but they wanted to keep their children. Or they wanted children in the future. And so the other piece that I had to wrap my mind around, which was not easy, was the fact that they felt that they had to have an abortion sometimes because they could not, as parents, willfully, in their mind, willfully give this child into the life of trafficking, which is what the pipeline would have been. Of course, we know logically there would have been help, there would have been support, but in their mind, the only option was I end the life of this child, or this child is going to experience horrific acts of sexual violence. And to them, that choice of ending the life was greater than what was going to happen. Now, of course, we understand that that may not have been the outcome. But in their minds, that was very real because that was what they were experiencing. So we have to understand and put ourselves in the mind of these women who are experiencing trafficking and then being forced to have these abortions or being coerced. It is because sometimes they feel like, how could I put my child in this life? It is just such a horrific thing to even have to contemplate as a mother. I can't imagine. But it was one of those things. I had several young mothers who had abortions because they just could not, no matter what supports were in place, no matter what we would come to as a plan. They just felt like this is going to be the outcome because that trafficker was saying, like, this is going to be the outcome of your child.
That's
So as a
heartbreaking.
mother,
Yeah.
they were doing the best thing they felt they could do as a parent.
And
And that is absolutely heartbreaking.
that to me also, yeah, I agree totally. And that sounds to me like just another piece or another form of
Yeah,
coercion by those
absolutely.
traffickers. And you know
Yes.
what that says to me also is that we do have these amazing, just like you said, I mean, we have these amazing, in our state, we have over 50 pregnancy resource centers that are
Yes.
working so hard
Yes.
to provide help to any woman who would ask for it, any woman who wants to make a life saving decision for her baby.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, part of I think that speaks to us that we've got to do a better job of getting the word out about these resources that are available and how we can help them. So in Kansas, we just this session, this legislative session, our legislators just passed a $2 million program that's called Alternatives to Abortion. And so part of that is going to be a public awareness campaign to help women see these resources, because you're so right.
Yep.
If they don't know that there is an alternative and their trafficker is telling them that there's not an alternative, how will they ever know? How will they ever know that they can choose life for that baby?
Yep.
We know that these are very complicated issues, and that's not just the simple answer, but we know that there are things we can do to help save more babies and save more women, more girls and women from these situations. So I think that's a great place for us to just kind of bring this together and say, okay, so as you know, more people are waking up to this uncomfortable reality, and that the terrible things are happening to vulnerable people in our communities.
Yeah.
And we're so grateful for people like you, Tatiana, who are facing the beast on a daily basis, and you are going into one-on-one work with these trafficking victims and to assist them, or you're also spreading the word. I know that maybe you're not doing the one-on-one work right now like you were before, but you're taking the message and you're helping more people learn about it. So we're really grateful for you and all your work in this and people like you. So, but for the average person who may have their own, regular full-time job that they're doing, and they're not, they're an accountant by day, or they're a hairstylist, whatever they're doing, but this is something that tugs at their heart. And, they see, their eyes are opened and they realize that this terrible pathway between repeated victimization through human trafficking, through sex trafficking, and then re-victimization through coerced or forced abortions, where the woman is just told she has no other option. This is what she's going to do, or is at least convinced of that by that trafficker. What can the average person, the Jane, the Sue, the Linda, what can we do, the Tom, and
Yes, I love that question so much. Well, number one, I think that if you are so like I always just think, if you're someone who is active in your church, start talking to the young people that you see at church. I cannot tell you how many amazing relationships young people have started to experience when someone kind of like just starts to have conversation with them, and then it starts to grow into like a mentorship and a friendship. That really, really can go a long ways. I've had many mothers who have wanted to step into the church space, who have gone to church, and just said, like, no one talks to me like that. I'm not going to go back. Like, I just feel so alone already. This just puts me in a place to feel even more isolated. And so if you are in a space or a community group or anything, like, and you see a young person or a young mother, please go up and just start a conversation. That like is number one. Then from there, I think too, like a huge barrier for survivors is like accessing healthy jobs, because they for so long have not had a career in your traditional, in work environment. And so being a place, like reaching out to organizations, youth organizations, if you are a professional, a business owner, saying, hey, I'm an accountant. How can I offer budgeting skills to, anyone in your program? If I have worked with so many hairstylists, it's not even funny, in my community, who are willing to offer. Many times we see that trafficking survivors they're forced to change their hair or to look a certain way for buyers. And so I've had many stylists say, like, I'll offer free services if a young person wants to go back to a natural hair color,
Wow.
any different hair color. Like, these are ways that you can help in real ways without having to like feel like you're trying to take on the world. Look at what you do, look at how you can extend that to a young person and just start there.
I love that so much. That is a
Yeah.
fantastic answer. That just makes so much sense that we can offer what we can do, what gifts can we give to a young, vulnerable mother, a
Yes.
young, vulnerable woman.
Yes.
And just, you know, in a way that is very respectful of her and treats her like the valuable person she is.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and that, you know, she can reinvent her life, and that
Yes.
we're there to be there to do it with her. If
Yes,
she
I
wants
actually,
that.
one young person that went to work at a salon, is such a great story, became friends with the stylist over time. And then they offered her a job just to clean and stuff. And now this person is like working in that salon and like building like their way up in this business of multiple salons that this person owns. And it's like the
Oh,
coolest thing ever.
I
So it
love
just
that.
started though, just in such a small way.
I love that. I love that so much.
Yeah.
And I do think too, you know, we need to keep the conversation happening, right? We need to
Yes.
make sure that this is not a taboo topic, and that
Yes.
people understand that if you're pro-life, this is also part
This is
of
a
your
pro-life
pro-life
issue.
mindset. This is
Yes.
something that you can take and talk to other people about, and also can be a bridge builder, like you were saying, with some very unlikely people,
Yeah.
maybe to help them understand how, you know, it's just destructive to the human
Yeah.
person, to that girl, that woman, and even to the ones who are involved in the other, that you said that there are three parties involved in this.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
destroying all three of those people.
Yes.
Let's be
Yes.
real.
Yes.
And
Yes.
you know, all three of those people are also redeemable and loved by God.
Come on. Yep.
Yep.
That's a
So
whole other topic for another podcast.
yes, no kidding. Well,
Yes.
this
Yes.
has
Yes.
been such an interesting discussion. It really has been wonderful. And I hope that our listeners have gotten as much from this as I've gotten. This has been fantastic. Such an insightful conversation. So,
Thank you for having me.
yeah. So on behalf of Kansans for Life, I just want to say thank you to you, Tatiana, and thank you to our listeners. We're really grateful for you for joining us. If you want to stay up to date, well, first of all, before I go to that, I want to say, if you want to hear more from Tatiana, she hosts her own podcast, and it's called Prophetic Justice, and you can find it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So you can look for her there. She is a fascinating person, has all kinds of great information to share and a lot of background. There's so much backstory we didn't have time to get into, her personal connections to this story and things that she found out about her own past as an adopted child. So I highly recommend you go and find Tatiana. And if you want to stay up to date on this and all pro-life topics, you can visit kfl.org. And then you can sign up to receive our updates there. So that's kfl.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, which is now called X, Instagram, YouTube, and also on TikTok. We're on all those places. So find us at Kansans for Life. And as we say goodbye, never forget, the pro-life movement is on the right side of history. Truth always wins in the end. So we hope you will join us next time. Thank you.